Well, today I'm excited to introduce our speaker to you. Kevin, come on up, Kevin. Kevin Stamper is the pastor of Restoration Church in Trinity, Florida. And it's a church plant. And how long have you been there, Kevin?
We've been there, let's see, is that working? We've been there 3 years. We planted 3 years ago.
Wow,
Yeah.
it's going pretty good?
It's going great.
That is good. And you've got your family with you?
Yeah, my wife's here, Marie, and then my kids are, well, I was told they were out front.
Yeah?
That's all I was told, is they were out front, and they play in parking lots all the time. It's fine.
Yeah. They're safe.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, they'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's good to have you here, brother. And God bless you. Share with us what God has laid on your heart. The pulpit is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, good morning. That good of a morning, huh? I saw there's coffee out there if you need that. I'm glad you're here this morning, and it's really a joy for me to be here to be able to share with you this morning. We got to spend the last couple days here and just kind of hang out. We went to the Space and Rocket Center yesterday and learned all about space. I think we got it all figured out. And so we just took all that in. It was a lot of fun. And my kids, while we were there, they saw those space helmets. You know those little fake space helmets, little plastic ones with the little visor that comes up and down? And they saw those, and they just started laughing because I didn't really remember this, but a couple months ago, we had an incident with one of those helmets in my house. My kids, they're 8 and 7. My son just turned 7 this last Friday. And so we had a thing in our house where we were at the Washington, we were in the Smithsonian, we had bought those same helmets. And we have this new member of our family. She's a dog, and her name's Hazel. And apparently we're keeping her, is what I've been told, because nobody's kicked her out yet. Like, she just keeps coming back inside, and she keeps living in our house, and we keep feeding her, and apparently we're keeping this dog. And so Hazel has been into everything. She's one of those dogs that's just into everything. When we send her outside, she likes to come in and bring us presents. A lot of times she's bringing back like dead frogs. Or one time she ate a slug, which that was enough. That was for me grounds to get rid of the dog, honestly. And she's brought in snakes before. While snakes are like biting her in the face, she'll be dragging snakes in. She's fearless. And so she gets into stuff all the time. And so what we've had to do is tell our kids, you need to start closing your doors to your room. Because Hazel's going to get in there. She's going to start taking things out of your room. She's going to start playing with your toys, thinking they're her toys. So you need to close the doors to your rooms. And my kids have not done great with this responsibility yet. And there was one day where we were all in the living room. My whole family, we're kind of sitting there. All the human people in my family are in one room. And I start hearing this noise down the hallway, down where the bedrooms are. I start hearing this really loud clanging noise. Just something's hitting all over the walls, all over the floor. And I look at my kids, and my daughter Jane's right there. I said, Jane, did you close the door to your room? And she goes, yeah, Dad, I did. Like, but did you? Yeah, I closed my door. Like, we're 100% sure we closed that door. Yes, I closed the door. I was like, but something's going on down there, Jane. Like, something's happening in your room right now, and it sounds like the dog got into your room. I'm hearing something that makes me think your door is not closed. And she's like, no, it's totally closed, Dad, 100%. And so we took a little field trip together, holding hands down that long hallway. And we got there, and guess what, guys? Door wasn't closed. I know, shocker. Door was wide open. And inside the room, our dog is in the room, and she has gotten her head stuck inside the space helmet. It's like stuck inside, and she can't get her head out of it. She's managed to open the visor, and now her snout is through, which is good. She's getting oxygen, but her snout is through the opening, and she cannot get the thing off of her head. And now we have a conundrum in my household because we have two sides that are both in trouble, right? Now you have to have a conversation with Jane, and we have to figure out how to save the dog from herself, right? And this is what happens. Now, today we're going to talk about this. We're going to kind of take this apart for just a bit and talk about what this feels like to have that moment where you've been caught. Have you ever had that moment where you've been caught? Like where the gig is up, the game is over, you've let everyone down, and you're just caught. You ever had this happen? I mean, maybe it was something that happened in a relationship. Maybe it was a decision you made. Maybe it was an addiction you had. Maybe there was a day where you just got caught. I know I sit with people as a pastor. There's many people I sit with And our church is called Restoration Church for a reason, because there's a lot of restoring going on. And I have to sit with people who come in and they sit on my couch in my office, or they sit on my couch in my home, and they tell me about things where they've been caught. You have people sit there and they tell you about addictions that they are caught in, and now everybody knows about it. You have people who sit there and they tell me about pregnancies that they now have because they've been caught. You have people who sit there and tell you about the things that they've done, and now they're caught. Have you ever been caught? The story we're going to look at today is about a person who's been caught. They've been caught. And it's not just one person, it's actually two sides that we'll see that get caught. Now, it's a very famous passage. If you've been around the church for a while, you may know this one. If you haven't, then it may be new to you, but we'll get to it in just a second. It's one of the most famous passages in the Bible, actually. It comes out of John chapter 8, and it actually has its own name. It's called the Pericope ad Adulterae. Now, that's just a Latin way of saying the adultery story. Now, if you know this, you've probably been around church, you've probably heard this story of a woman who was caught in adultery. It's a very famous story. It's been around a long time, but it's one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. This passage has had controversy written all over it for years and years and years. The reason being, we don't know where this passage came from. We don't know where it originated from. We don't think John actually wrote this, even though it's in John's gospel, even though it's in John chapter 8. We don't think John actually wrote this. This story shows up somewhere around the 4th century after Jesus. We don't know where it came from. We don't know why it showed up. Actually, if you look at the oldest manuscripts that we have in Greek that show this story, the story is written in the margin, like in the sides. It's just kind of scribbled in. And some scribes started just writing this story into John's gospel. Now, it's also been shown up at different times in different places in history. It's shown up in Luke after Luke 14. It's shown up after Luke 21. And some people want to put it in Luke's gospel. But there's a reason that I think it shows up in John's gospel. And the reason is that I think John shows us this picture of Jesus that we don't get to see almost anywhere else. John has this fascinating view of Jesus. And if you'll let me just for a second explain that, I think it's fascinating what John does. See, John writes his gospel much later than everybody else. Everybody else has their gospels written. Matthew and Mark and Luke have written their gospels. But by this point, Jesus has been gone from the earth for about 45 years. And Matthew has been burned at the stake. And Paul has been beheaded. And Peter has been crucified upside down. If anybody tells you that following Jesus is easy, they're wrong. This is what his followers were going through. And people were starting to lose hope. And so they went to John and they said, John, you were with Jesus. Would you write something to remind us what it was like to be with Jesus? Like, you were so close to Jesus. You spent your life following Jesus. What was that like? Because we don't know what it's like anymore. It's been 45 years. There's new generations that no longer know what it looks like to follow Jesus. They don't know who Jesus was. He wasn't here with them. Can you explain what it was like to be with Jesus? I mean, you were close enough. You could take selfies with Jesus. Like, your locations, when you checked into places, were at the same place as Jesus. You knew Jesus that well. Can you explain Jesus to everyone? And so John writes this gospel really out of a need for everybody to know who Jesus is. And what he writes is totally different than everybody else. And if you have a Bible or a phone or a tablet, it'll be on the screen here in a second, you can follow along. But we're going to start in just John chapter 1 real quick and look at what John writes about Jesus. And John writes this piece that's almost like poetry at the beginning of his book. It's so beautiful. It's so well put together. Many scholars believe that he wrote this after he wrote the book. He went back and put like a preamble in there. And this is what he writes in John chapter 1, verse 14. He talks about Jesus as the Word. And he says the Word, meaning Jesus, this logo, the word there is logo, meaning the logo of God, the logos of God. This Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, this word dwelling is the word tabernacled. If you're familiar with that from the Old Testament, it means he came and he was with us. When John's talking about with us, he's not talking about us, like all of us. He's not talking about you and me. He's talking about them. Like, he spent his time with just the disciples. We saw something that the world had never seen before. He made his dwelling among us. This word is like so conversational, this dwelling word, this tabernacled word. In fact, if you look at this in the Message translation, I love the way Eugene Peterson says it. He says that the word became flesh and blood, and then it says, and then he moved into the neighborhood. Like Jesus just moved into the neighborhood. So he made his dwelling among us. And it says right after that, in verse 16, it says, from the fullness, let's go back to that. It says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father. This is huge. And it says, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. Now, Pastor Mylan and I were talking about me coming up here and spending some time in beautiful Alabama. And guys, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm from Florida, and I was really discouraged because I got here this week and it's hotter here than it is in Florida. And like, why? Why are we doing that, guys? It was real warm. And so we got here to hang out, and I was talking to Mylan, like, what do you want me to speak about? What could I preach on? What would be helpful? And one of the things he said, well, actually, we're the Grace Place. It's kind of what we're known as, right? The Fairview Grace Place. He's like, we're known as that, but it'd be great if you could kind of speak towards, like, maybe the truth side, too, or maybe both. And I was like, okay, I'll try my best. I'll try to speak on both sides. Because what we see here is that Jesus is doing something that nobody has ever done before. It says that he came full of grace and truth. Both. Now, the and there is very important. This doesn't mean that it's 50-50. The fullness does not mean that it's 50-50. Does not mean that he was 50% grace and 50% truth. It actually means like 100-100. He is 100% grace. He is 100% truth. He will always be fully both. He is an and. He is and. Fullness of grace and truth. My brother worked at a Chick-fil-A when he was in college. You guys have chicken huts around here. The Jesus chicken, right? Yeah. And I should never bring it up on a Sunday. That is my fault, because it's rude to bring it up on a Sunday, and then everybody's like, oh, I want Jesus chicken, and then you're like, it's closed on Sundays. Why would we talk about it? That's just mean. But he worked at the Jesus chicken place, and there was a lady who came in almost every day to his specific chicken hut, and she would walk in, and she was this little old lady. Now, my brother is a large man. My brother makes me look very small. I'm the runt of our litter. My brother's about 6'6". He's probably close to 400 pounds, which is good because that's what you want if you're trusting somebody with food, right? You don't want a skinny chef. You want somebody who knows the product, right? He knows the product. And so he would work behind the counter, and this lady would come in every single day, and she would order the same thing. And she'd walk up to the counter, and she'd look at the screen, and it said on the screen that they had the chicken biscuit, and it said with sausage or bacon. And at this time, you could add those things to the side of your plate. And she would come in every day, and she would look at him, and she'd say, son, I'll have the chicken biscuit with sausage or bacon. And you'd be like, okay, ma'am, which would you like, the sausage or the bacon? Son, I would like the chicken biscuit with sausage or bacon. He'd say, I understand, ma'am. Which would you like, the sausage or the bacon? Literally, she would go, son, I need you to turn around and look at that screen and read it with me. I'll have the chicken biscuit with sausage or bacon. And finally, he just started giving her sausage and bacon. He just started putting both on the plate. You couldn't argue with her. Now, while she meant or when she saw and, many times in this verse, we see and when instead of and, we mean or. We believe there is grace or truth. That's how our world works. We don't work in these things where there's like in-between things. We like absolutes. We like to go all the way to extremes. I don't know if you've noticed how our world works, guys, but right now we are trying to polarize ourselves further than we ever have before. You are either on one side or the other. There is nothing in between. If we understand anything about the way and the teachings of Jesus, it should teach us that there is no or, that he lived in an and. It was something completely different than the world had ever seen before. He was not going to be put in a box. He was not going to be used for our agenda. Instead, he was going to use us for his agenda. He did not work on one side or the other. He was an and. He worked as an and. This is grace and truth. If I learned anything growing up with Schoolhouse Rock, I learned that there's conjunction junction, and you may say, what's your function? They would say hooking up words and phrases and clauses That's what's happening right here. It's not taking or, it's not grace or truth, it's grace and truth. Both. I believe if we understand this, it will change the way we parent. I know you just came out of a series on parenting and families. It will change how we deal with difficult people. It will change how you work with your coworkers. It will change how you interact with your parents. It will change how you interact with difficult siblings. If you understand grace and truth. That's what Jesus brought to the table. And it says after this, in verse 16, it says, from the fullness of his grace, talking about Jesus, the fullness of his grace, we have received one blessing after another. In fact, some translations would say, we have received grace upon grace that's already given. We have so much grace. We've been given grace by Jesus. That's happened over and over again. And then verse 17, it says, for the law was given through Moses. So we have a law, we have tenets, we have these structures in place. The law was given from Moses, but it says grace and truth came through Jesus. Yes, Moses gave us tenets of faith, and that was good, but Jesus gave us a tension of our faith. There's tension between grace and truth. And he says that grace and truth came through Christ Jesus. Again, we want to be in an or situation. Some of you right now are the parent who is the grace parent. Some of you are the parent who's the truth parent, right? And right now, truth is elbowing grace. I know what's happening right now. Like I know how this works. One of you is that parent. You know which one you are, right? When your kids get in trouble, you know which one it is that they run to, and they go to that one first. This is how it works, guys. I know my parents, I grew up in a pastor's home. My dad was a pastor. My mom was a pastor. My brother's a pastor. It was like the family business. And I only say that to tell you I have more therapy bills than you do. But I grew up in a pastor's home, and one of the responsibilities of growing up in a pastor's home is you have to be in every musical that your church puts on. If they're going to put on a cantata, you are the star of that show, and it's all on your shoulders, kid. Don't mess it up. Your father's job literally depends on it. It's a lot of fun. It's exciting. And my family, we were in a show at one point. There was one that came up, and my dad would play the piano on one side of the stage. My mom would play the keyboard on the other side of the stage. Again, as pastors, this is just a mandatory thing, is you marry a woman who can play the keyboard on the opposite side of the stage from you. And so we showed up to the musical. We showed up that day. We had our normal garb on. You know the musical, like you have to wear a white shirt with black pants, right? This is a church musical. And so we showed up with our white shirts and our black pants. And there was a moment where I had to leave because I was about to sing a solo. And I left for a second. I left the stage, and I had to go to the bathroom. And then I came back on the stage. And apparently while I was in the bathroom, I didn't know it, but like I had left my zipper open, like wide open. And I had tucked my white shirt just right through that zipper. And I was just hanging out in there. And so I came out to sing my solo and dazzle everyone. And I walked out on the stage, and as soon as my dad saw me, he stopped playing the piano, and he fell off the bench because he was laughing at me so hard. He was literally rolling on the floor laughing at me. My mom was on this side of the stage, and she's sitting there, and she's whisper yelling. You know how moms have this ability to whisper yell? She's whisper yelling across the stage. She's going, Kevin, you need to tuck your shirt back in. Your zipper's down. Roger, get up off the floor. Start playing the piano again. Kevin, your zipper is down. Your shirt is down. Roger, get off the floor. Don't laugh at your son. There's one that's grace and one that's truth. You figure them out. You figure out which one's grace, which one's truth. My mom, she calls her parents, to this day, she calls her parents mother and daddy. You figure out which one was truth and which one was grace. Right? This is how this works. There's this thing about this where we go to polarizations of the two. We go to these two different sides. We try to pick an or instead of an and. And Jesus is not an either or. He is a both and of grace and truth. And so I believe that this pericope ad adulteri, this story of this woman, gets put in the book of John. And the reason it gets put in the book of John is because he talks about this tension between grace and truth. And in this story, we see grace and truth both played out. But I also believe that it gets put in the book of John, and the reason it gets told at all is one of the most beautiful reasons of all. Scholars couldn't figure out where to put this story. They didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know if they should include it in the Bible. And the reason they put it in the Bible is because it sounded like Jesus. It just sounded like something Jesus would do. You hear the story and you're like, that's got to be Jesus. This grace and this truth. So we're going to turn to John chapter 8, and we're going to read a part of the Bible that might not have even been part of the Bible. So just enjoy. In your Bible, it might be in italics, it might be in parentheses. This part of the Bible, again, we don't know exactly where the story came from, but we know this, that it sounds like Jesus, this one who's full of grace and truth. So verse 1, it says, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now this is a moment where Jesus goes to pray. I think we have this idea a lot of times with Jesus where he goes to pray. And we think he's going to pray because we think that he's like reactively praying for things. I believe that Jesus is proactively praying for things. I think he knows what his next encounter is, and I think he's praying that God would give him wisdom and strength in the next encounter he's about to have, because this next one is a big one. It says this, at dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. Now, Jesus shows up in the temple courts. He's showing up to teach. This is also a fun fact, just in case you're ever wondering. It says almost every time that he sits down to teach. He would sit down with his disciples. He would sit down in a circle with them to teach. That was not common of rabbis. Jesus was a rabbi. Rabbis did not sit down to teach. They stood to teach. They stood above you because they were better than you. Jesus always sits down to teach. Just a fun fact about Jesus. It says he sat down to teach them, and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, now they're in the temple courts, they brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group. They brought a woman in, and I'm sure this was all of the dramatics you can imagine. Can you imagine sitting in a room like this right now? This is what it was like. This is a temple court. Sitting in a room like this where things are relatively calm, relatively quiet. You're learning from the Bible. You're learning from a teacher. And all of a sudden, a mob breaks in. And it's religious leaders of your day. It's people who are big deal people. It's people who would be on the Preachers and Sneakers Instagram feed. These are big deal people. And they burst through the doors. And they bring in a person who's been caught in adultery and lay them in front of the entire congregation. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine what would it feel like to be that woman? To be brought in and laid in front of everyone else in the darkest moment of your life, in the most shameful moment of your life. This is what it's like to be caught. My family, we've been through some things with this. I have a relative who she was married to a man who we thought was a great guy. We were really for him. He was a Christian. He went to church. He led lots of Bible studies. Lots of people were very impressed with him. And one day, she got a phone call, and it was from a credit card company who was asking her about some charges she had made on her credit card. And she said, I don't have that credit card. I think this is the wrong company. I don't have that credit card. And they said, no, you do. They asked her some more questions. And she started to look through the charges and find out more about this credit card. And it turned out that her husband had been literally flying women in to town when she would leave town. And he was using this credit card to carry on what we know of as about 8 different affairs. This is a good man. This is a man that everybody trusted. And all of a sudden, he was caught. So he tried to go through some recovery. He went through some rehab. He went to Celebrate Recovery, if you're familiar with that. Great program. Spent time in that. About month 9, one of the things they asked him to do was to write a letter to everyone he had harmed. To write a letter to anyone he had offended or that he had harmed in the process of these affairs. They say this is the hardest month because very few people make it through it because it's so hard to be caught. This is the moment you're admitting to everyone what you've done. He couldn't do it. He did not write the letters. He ended up just saying, this is who I am. You're going to have to deal with it. And he walked away from his wife and his 4 kids. It's so hard to be caught. It's so hard because you're putting the judgment of yourself in other people's hands. And in this case, she's literally putting her life in other people's hands. It's a scary moment when you put your life, who you are, in the hands of others, and you're vulnerable about that. But let me say, we'll see why you should do that and why this is worth it. And she's brought in, she's been caught in adultery. And it says this, in verse 4, it says, "And they said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery.' Then they say, 'In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?'" Now, here's what we know, okay? I don't know if you know how affairs work. I don't have a lot of experience, but I know this. It takes 2 to tango is, I think, a phrase. You can't commit adultery like by yourself. There's usually another person involved in that scenario. What they just said is that there was a woman caught in adultery, just her, and they show up and they lay her at the feet, and they say, "The law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" Now that is true. The law of Moses back in the Old Testament does say that you should stone such women. But let's just rewind the tape real quick, and let's look at what the law actually says. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, that's where we see this law show up. And this law actually says, it says that if a man... Well, I'll read it here. "If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, the wife of his neighbor," meaning both the adulterer and the adulteress, "are to be put to death." Both of them. Notice they don't bring in the adulterer, they only bring in the adulteress. Where's the adulterer? Where's this dude at? Why are they only bringing one in? Where's the other one? Why did they forget him? Where'd he go? Because the law clearly says that it's not just one person, but it's both. Now, I'm just going to do some speculating here for a second. I'm going to be honest with you. This is not in the Bible. This is not in the Bible. This is the KSV. This is the Kevin Stamper version of the Bible. Not recommended. But let me just try to explain something real quick, because there's a huge conspiracy going on in this moment. What's happening in this moment is so fascinating, because you have to ask the questions, right? Let's do a little bit of like CSI work here, okay? So if we're trying to understand that there is a woman who's been caught in adultery, how did these guys know she was committing adultery? How did these Pharisees and rabbis and religious leaders, how do they know that she's out there committing adultery? How do they know what time, where she was going to be, how to catch her? How do they know about that? And thirdly, where's the man? Where's this other guy? Where's the adulterer? Where did these people show up? Many scholars believe that what's happening in this verse, the reason that they knew that she was committing adultery, they knew where she was committing adultery, and they knew that there was another person they did not bring with them, is that many people believe they set her up with one of the religious leaders of the day. The adulterer, the man that she was having an affair with, was one of the religious leaders himself. That he set her up for this. You see what just happened? The people who were so self-righteous, the people who came in to speak the truth part, the people who were there to condemn her, they've gone on such a massive journey of self-righteousness, they've gone all the way back to unrighteousness. By chasing self-righteousness so far, so hard, they end up going full circle all the way back to unrighteousness. Friends, I don't know if you've been a part of a church for a long time. I don't know if you've been following Jesus for a long time. This is one of the things that I get most concerned about for myself, is if you pay attention to Jesus, Jesus is just as concerned about self-righteousness as he is unrighteousness. Because both self-righteousness and unrighteousness negate the need for Jesus. Because unrighteousness says, I don't need Jesus because I live the way I want when I want. Self-righteousness says, I don't need Jesus because I can earn my own way in. You've just negated Jesus in both things. These people have gone so far in their search for self-righteousness, they've actually come up unrighteous. And Jesus is about to expose that to them. He's about to make this playing field level once again on both sides. It says in verse 6, they were using this as a question to trap him in order to have a basis for accusing him. Notice that they're not using this as this is not about the woman. This is not about the woman who's caught in adultery. She's just a pawn in a game. They're using this to trap Jesus. And this is the part that just sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? It says, but Jesus then bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Now, a lot of people have different interpretations of what Jesus is doing here because he kneels down. They're in the middle of this heated moment. There's a lot of conversation going on. You would imagine everybody in the temple has stopped to watch what Jesus is going to do. And Jesus just kneels down and just starts writing in this dirt. Why does he write in the dirt? Why does he do that? Is he just stalling? Like, is this just a stalling tactic? Is he just stressed and like this is like an adult coloring book situation where I just need my colored pencils and I'll get through it, you know? Hashtag self-care. Is that what he's doing? Is what's happening right here? Why is Jesus doing this? Some people believe that he's writing scripture in this dirt, and that's probably very likely. Some people believe that it's Jeremiah 17:13, which was a verse that was read at every Rosh Hashanah, would have been the closing ceremonies of every Rosh Hashanah. In that verse, it says that he will write the names of those on the dirt. And so maybe he's writing this verse and then writing their names of everybody standing around him. Some scholars believe that. But most likely what he's doing is actually when you came to the temple and you had a dispute between two parties and you came into the temple courts, it was common for the rabbi who was hearing your case to bend down and to write in the sand. They didn't have a lot of paper. And so what they would write in the sand was they would write the law that you had broken. They would write down the law to remind you what the law said. And you just got to imagine, wouldn't this be fun to watch? Jesus kneels down in the sand and starts writing the verse we just read out of Leviticus 20, verse 10, where he starts writing that you will bring both the man and the woman. And maybe he just starts underlining the word man. Maybe he's looking around the crowd just a little bit. Like, which one is it? And then it says, as he's writing this with his finger, they kept on questioning him, so he straightened up and he said to them, this famous line you've probably heard a million times, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. He puts it on them. If you guys are without sin, then go for it. Now, the good news about this situation is Jesus knows he's the only one without sin. But he says, if you guys have those, then if you're good, then if you can do this with a clear conscience, then you need to go ahead and do it. If you can do this in the way that you think you're supposed to, then go ahead and throw the first stone. And it says, again, he stooped down and he continued to write this verse on the ground, showing these people that you're not as unlike this woman as you think you are. You've sinned just as much as she has. He's calling them out by writing in the dirt. This is why Jesus is awesome. And then he says right here, it says, at this, those who heard, notice this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. It wasn't that they read what they saw, it's that those that heard it. It went deep into them when they heard this scripture, when they felt convicted. It wasn't just they saw the law, they heard the law. Those that heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, because if you're like me, as the older you get, the more you know the sins you have in your life. The more aware you are of the things you've done wrong. The more that you realize who you've hurt and what you've broken in your life. The older ones start going away first until only Jesus was left with the woman standing there. And Jesus straightened up and he asks her, woman, where are they? It's like almost like a joke, right? Like, so where'd they go? He says, has no one condemned you? Has no one condemned you? Now, remember, at this moment, when he asks this question, Jesus still holds her life in his hands. He has not committed a sin. He has every right from what he just said to pick up that stone and to stone her. Jesus holds her life in his hands at this moment. And this right here, friends, is why you want Jesus to hold your life in his hands. It's because look at his response. She says, "No one, sir." And he says, "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. But notice this last line. He says, now go, and, notice the and leave your life of sin. Wait, Jesus, is this grace or truth? Which one is it? The answer is yes. Go and leave your life of sin. I don't condemn you, but I also don't want you to keep living the way you've been living. It's an and situation. He says, go and leave your life of sin. You need to leave behind what you've been doing. It can't stay the same. There is grace and there is truth, and Jesus is fully both. And here's the thing that I love about this is like this and situation for us. If we pay attention to this and, I think it has huge power for us. I was doing some videos not long ago for a church that I used to work at, and they asked me to come in and meet with some guys that were getting baptized. And so I showed up to meet with these guys that were getting baptized, and they were sitting there and they were kind of going through their stories. Now, this was a prison ministry. It was all guys that had come out of prison, and there were about 12 guys who were going to get baptized. Some of them were literally people who had sold so many drugs, some had done so many drugs. They were just these awesome guys that were like tatted up to their eyes, and it was so much fun. I got to sit down with them and talk to them about their stories and walk through all this stuff. And I would ask them, tell me about your life. Tell me about why you're getting baptized. Why are you doing the things you're doing? And there was one guy I sat down with, and I loved his statement because the first thing he looked at me and he said, "Hi, my name's Alex. I'm a Christian, and I'm a drug addict." Now, that's an and we don't hear very often, right? I think we're used to hearing I'm a Christian or I'm an addict. But the reality is, without truth in his life, Alex would have never known he was an addict. And without grace in his life, he would have never become a Christian. That's an and. That's what we want. This is grace and truth. I mean, I don't want him to live in drug addiction the rest of his life, but without that truth spoken to his life, that would have never happened. And here's why I love this story more than just what it says about grace and truth, is that it sounds like Jesus, but even more than it sounding like Jesus, it sounds like us. It sounds like you and me. We could put ourselves in this story so easily if we wanted to, couldn't we? I mean, some of us are the people that walk around with stones, and we can't wait to just hit people with truth all day long, right? Some of us, we love to be that person. There's a great book, if you ever get a chance to read it. It's called My Year of Living Biblically. It's by a guy named A.J. Jacobs, who decided he took all 613 laws in the Old Testament, and he decided to live them out for a year. He lived in New York City, and so he would have to actually walk around with non-mixed fiber clothing. He couldn't cut the corners of his beard. He had a goat with him and a staff. He would get on the subway in New York. And the weird thing about New York is he was one of the more normal people there. I was like, thank you for somebody who's pretty average around here. So he was this guy for a year. He tried to follow all 613 laws of the Old Testament. And there was one day where he said he had been carrying around little pebbles in his pocket for months because he was hoping to find an adulterer that he could stone. And so he was at a Starbucks, and he ordered his coffee, and he couldn't touch the woman because you can't touch a woman, and so he couldn't touch the woman even if she was handing him his change. And so he just was like, "Can you put it on the counter and just slide it to me?" And so she slid it to him, like looking at him like he was crazy because he was. And so she slides the change across the counter. He puts it in his hand. He puts it in his pocket. And as he's standing there, he hears a man talking on the phone next to him, and he's on his cell phone, and he's having this like beautiful conversation with this woman on the other side of the phone. And he was like, I could tell they were just having a really great conversation. It was really beautiful. And so he said, I stopped and I looked at him, and he was like, I love it that you and your wife talk like that. That's really awesome. And he goes, and the guy looks at me and actually says, "Oh, that's not my wife. That's actually the woman I'm leaving my wife for." And he goes, "Wait, so you're an adulterer?" And he reached in his pocket and he held them out. He goes, "I have to throw these at you." And the guy goes, "No, you don't." He's like, "No, I do. I have to throw these at you." And the guy actually reacted really quickly, and he said the guy took the stones out of his hand and threw it back at him and ran down the street. And he was like, it was my one chance to stone somebody, and I missed it. Now, some of us are carrying rocks in our pockets all the time. Some of us love to be the truth, and we love to carry those things with us, and we are walking around waiting for somebody to slip up so we can throw rocks at them. Some of us are the people who are on the other side, and we are the people with grace, and we are so scared to say any truth to anyone because we don't understand the difference between condemnation and conviction. Jesus speaks to her in conviction, go and leave your life of sin, but he also says he does not condemn her. There is a difference between condemnation and conviction. And we're so scared to say anything to anybody because we're so afraid, and we just have to give grace upon grace upon grace, and that's great. But there comes moments where Jesus says you also have to speak in truth. The way of Jesus, if you come tonight, we're going to talk about this like way more, but the way of Jesus is a tension between grace and truth. The way of Jesus is so different than anything the world has put out in front of us, and we cannot just fall into one camp or the other. We have to choose a yes and, a both and, not an either or. And some of us are so afraid of that we just do grace upon grace to the point where we don't say anything that matters anymore. And we've lost our voice speaking grace instead of saying anything that speaks truth. And for some of us in this room, the reason this story sounds like us is because we're that woman. We're that person who's been brought in the lowest point of our lives, and we've been caught. And maybe you're a person here who's been caught. Maybe you're a person who's been brought before people and you've now had to allow yourself to admit the things you've done wrong. That's a terrifying place to be. I mean, I know when I was doing student ministry, I would go to these conferences, and there was this one guy that I remember hearing from, and this is not a bad illustration, don't get me wrong, I get it. But he would take a flower, he'd take like a rose, and he would take the rose and he'd hand it to somebody in the front row. He'd say, take this rose, and then I want you to pass it to the next person. And then the next person would take the rose, and they'd pass it to the next person, pass it to the next person. And by the time the rose had gone around the room, 100 kids had handled the rose, and eventually the rose would come back to the front of the room. And he'd pick up that rose, and it's all wilted now, and it's all messed up. It doesn't look good anymore. It's not pretty. And he would hold up the rose, and he would say to everybody, he would say, see this rose? This rose has been used up by everybody out there. This rose has been handled by so many people. And he would say, and this rose, see it now? He would say, it's worthless. Nobody wants this anymore, do they? And everybody would be like, no, nobody wants that anymore. And I just remember sitting there and like having this gut reaction where something inside of me wanted to just scream out, no, you don't understand. No, Jesus died for that rose. Jesus still wants that rose. Jesus has not given up on that rose. And you may be here today in a spot where you've been caught and you've had some things happen that you're not proud of. And you may feel beaten up and broken, but at the end of the day, there's still a Jesus who wants to speak grace and he wants to speak truth to you. He does not want to condemn you. He still wants to say, though, there's a better life if you leave that life of sin behind. And I'm here for that. There's a Jesus who loves you that much. And maybe you're that woman. This is why you want to put your life in the hands of Jesus. Because he wants to bring grace. He wants to speak truth. He wants to not condemn. He may want to convict. But he died for you and he loves you. No matter how much you have hurt yourself and hurt others. If you're in that spot today, this is a good time to come talk about it. It's a good time to come forward. You can pray about that. You can speak with others about that. This is a good time. If you haven't been caught and you're carrying something on, this is a good day to get caught. This is a good day to allow yourself to be caught because Jesus wants to hold your life in his hands. So this is a good moment for that. Today we're going to sing and we're going to close together. I want to pray for you before we do that. And again, I want to ask you if you're willing to, there's altars up here. You're welcome to come out and pray as the band sings. You're welcome to respond right where you're at. I would ask you right now, if you could ask yourself, who are you in this story? Have you been carrying around a bunch of rocks? Have you only been speaking grace? Or are you this woman who's been caught? Who are you today? As you think about this, as you reflect on this, I'd ask you to come and just, you can pray up here, you can pray right where you're at, and respond to what Jesus is doing in your life. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for your word. I thank you for this story. I thank you for just a story that sounds like Jesus. If we were to say, what is Jesus like? Well, this is what he's like. This sounds like something he would do. Thank you for the moments we've been self-righteous and you have brought us back down. I thank you for the moments where we've been unrighteous and you've brought us back up. I thank you for the moments where we've been caught and you don't condemn us. You just want us to leave the life behind, the life of sin, and walk into a new life with you. Jesus, we thank you for your words, for your teachings. We thank you for who you are, not just who you were when you were here on the earth, but who you are right now in our own lives. The way you're still transforming us, the way you're still teaching us, the way you're still guiding us. We thank you for being the kind of God who just loves us, no matter what. It's so hard to find in this world. So we thank you for being a God who does things different than the world around us, who leads us in a different path, a God who's an and, not an or. I pray we learn from that in our own lives, in our parenting, in our relationships, in our workplaces, and carry that into the world around us. So those things I ask in your name.